everyone. My name is Kenneth Dean, the Dean of Metal, along with my co-host Chris K. Welcome to Debating Metal, the show where we offer you our sincere and honest opinions on the music we all love, heavy metal. And this week we're doing something a little different. We're giving you our opinion on Revolver Magazine's article, The 10 Greatest 3-Album Runs in Heavy Metal History.
A few months back, Revolver published the piece Kenneth mentioned, and we're going to give you our take on the article. These are all bands that we know and love, but might not necessarily agree with their assessment.
So sit back, relax, and let the debate begin. The top 10 greatest 3-album runs in heavy metal history. All right, Chris, so the Revolver Magazine put out this article about the 10 greatest 3-album runs in heavy metal history, if you want to put it that way. And, you know, I immediately saw this and I started looking at the names and the bands and the albums, and I didn't necessarily agree with everything that was on their list, but it definitely made for something that I brought to you. I said, hey, I think this is a really good thing that we should talk about, and you had the same idea as soon as you read it. So this is why we're here to talk about this. So why don't you go ahead and do you want to start with number 10? Or do you want me to start with number? You know what? You go ahead. You start with number 10 because you're a little bit more versed on Tool than I am, and then I could talk a little bit more about Slipknot at number 9.
All right. So as you mentioned, and we're going in the order from the last on their list to the top. So I'm not sure if they put it in any particular order. It did kind of feel like it was number 1 through 10. I think we both kind of agreed on that, but. So they had Tool as their number 10. And for me, like, I don't even think of Tool necessarily as heavy metal. They do have some metal kind of background, like their first EP, Opiate, and their first album had more of a metal kind of vibe to it than what they later became. But I mean, it's to each their own. I mean, you can consider them metal or not. Their run that they picked was Undertow, Anima, and Lateralus. Like I said, the first one a little more metal. Then they kind of evolved and became more of like mathematical based hard rock music. Really kind of interesting stuff. I was a big fan in high school. I liked a lot of the more complicated stuff they were writing, and some of the videos they put out were really cool. I thought all 3 albums were pretty dang solid, and then they kind of went on a hiatus for a while. They released 10,000 Days, I want to say early 2000s.
10,000 Days came out in 2006. 2006,
so late 2000s, I guess. I wasn't a big fan of that one, to be honest, and I haven't really been following them since. But those first 3 albums really were truly very solid, and they were on a streak there. So, what's your take on Tool being on this list?
The funny thing about Tool for me was, I was, they started towards the end of the MTV age, and I say it like that because obviously we all know that MTV doesn't show any videos anymore. So, in 1993 when Undertow came out, they're still showing some videos. They still have, I think Headbangers Ball was still on. So they were towards the end of that run there. And man, they used to play the crap out of Sober, and they played the crap out of Prison Sex. I think was the video that they had. So it's like, those were cool songs, and the videos were just as cool. And then they you didn't hear from them for 3 years. And it's like, where'd they go? And then, Anima comes out, and that album really didn't grab me too much. It wasn't until Lateralus came out in 2001 that was it 2001? Yeah,
I think so.
It wasn't. Yeah, Lateralus came out in 2001. So it wasn't until I heard Lateralus and they had the song "Schism" was a huge hit on rock radio, and then I was like, oh, this is cool. And this funny thing is, I was like, man, these guys haven't been around for a while. When you think about it, it was five years since Anima came out.
Yeah.
And bands get lost in that time, but for some reason, Tool has been able to kind of circumvent that. Like right now, Fear Inoculum, their latest album. I mean, they're doing sellout arena tours right now, and that album came out 13 years after 10,000 Days. I mean, that's a long period of time.
That's the hiatus I was referring to. I mean, I kind of included 10,000 Days in that, but that was more of what was going on in my life, I guess, technically, where I missed that. But yeah, I guess for me it was a little different because I remember 92 Opiate came out, and I wasn't aware of it until Undertow came out. So when Undertow came out, they had 3 really big hits on it. To me, that's my favorite album from the band. It's a little heavier from beginning to end. I think it's pretty good as far as like just a consistent good quality on each track. There isn't one that I think is just like crappy and you need to skip. And then Anima came out 3 years later, and that's not a huge gap. A lot of bands have a 3-year gap between releasing albums. That's not uncommon
too bad
now. So that's not bad. But I thought that album was really good. It had Stinkfist on it, Anima, 46 and 2. What was the last track? Third Eye. That was really cool. Eulogy. This had a tribute to Bill Hicks on it, and I was a big fan of Bill Hicks as a comedian at that time in my life. Like he was one of those that I think a lot of people kind of caught attention because of Tool. But I had actually seen him on it was a HBO special and with Rodney Dangerfield on it, and watching stuff I probably shouldn't have watched as a kid, but it was, I thought it was a really good album. And then technically, yeah, it was 2001 before they released another album, but they also had that Salival release in between, which was like a live kind of video box set with outtakes and all kinds of other stuff.
Yeah, it kept the interest
them
going.
Relevant. Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember there was some additional tracks and that kind of stuff that maybe not quite finished stuff, but it was enough to keep them relevant in the eyes of the fans. And then Lateralus came out, and that was huge when I was in high school. That was 2001, and I remember all 4 years of my high school, like just hearing that on the radio constantly in my art classes when we would listen to the radio and stuff like that. It was there the entire time. And somehow after that, I just kind of lost track of them, and 10,000 Days came out, and I felt like every album before that, they had been very kind of revolutionary. They had progressed, but then 10,000 Days came out, and I felt like it was more of what was on Lateralus, and I was a little disappointed by that. Just never really paid attention to them again.
Yeah, I could agree with that assessment where 10,000 Days does seem like an extension of Lateralus. The one thing I could tell you, looking at the 3 albums, Undertow has a slightly different sound. Now, when I say slightly, it's a first album, even though it's the second release. It's their first, album. Zoo Entertainment was the label. They were getting distributed by BMG, so there was some money behind it. And that was produced by a woman named Sylvia Massey and the band themselves. And so one thing I noticed, the second, Anima and Lateralus, those albums were produced by David Bottrill, and then Lateralus was David Bottrill and Tool together. And one thing I was reading a little bit about, can't remember what band I was reading something about, but they talked about how once they got in the studio for their first album and they were given a certain amount of control, they never let it go. They maintained that control. So actually it was Rob Halford. When I was listening to his book and reading some of it, he mentioned how on the first album they kind of were co-producing it with Roger Glover. Or was it Roger Glover? No, Roger Glover did the second one, Sad Wings. I think it was Roger Bain, who's the guy.
Yeah, I kind of remember the story, and it was more just that they don't like that first album for a lot of reasons, and it has to do with who owns the album now,
right?
But also they didn't have a lot of control over it. They didn't have a lot of control over their sound, and it's not something that they felt reflected them as a band.
Right, exactly. Yes, it was Roger Bain who produced Rock-A-Rolla, and that's the guy who produced Black Sabbath's first bunch of albums. So Rob talked about how every album, they always had some sort of control. Now, it doesn't necessarily reflect on, produced by, in some cases, because they said that their collaboration with Tom Allom was always Tom Allom and produced by Tom Allom and Judas Priest, and that's not the case. It's not the way the credits read on the albums, but it could be co-produced in there, or it could be assisted by, like Metallica's album Ride of Lightning says produced by Metallica. It's clear as day on the back of the album, but when you look inside the liner notes, it says assisted by Flemming Rasmussen and Mark Whitaker. Mm-hmm. So, those little things here and there. It shows, especially in Tool's case, it shows that they've been in control of their music, in control of their sound since the beginning. And you can tell the guitars sound a little rough on Undertow compared to Anima and Lateralus and 10,000 Days and the way they are now. But it still sounds great. I mean, the bass is recorded really, really well. You hear a ton of that bottom end on the records, and that maintains through all the other recordings. So when David Bottrill came in and did Anima and then Lateralus, he went along with their sound, and so they never lost that Tool sound. It's just, I think the guitars got better, and that's something to be said. Why and how bands are able to maintain and continue to grow, because I personally think the bands that like to experiment from album to album, until you have a particular formula in your songwriting, it almost seems dysfunctional.
Yeah.
The greatest bands in the world usually have a formula, and that doesn't mean that they're repeating themselves, but they usually have a formula as to why they're successful.
Well, I mean, then you think about the Beatles, and they continuously evolved until they broke up.
Yeah, but like if you think about the first bunch of albums, they had a particular style. They grew up in that middle period, like year 4 and 5, and then they just totally went into experimentation. But mm-hmm. They were already huge at that point. Oh, yeah. I mean, so you can do that. But like for instance, a band like Kiss, who had no credibility after their first 3 albums, couldn't sit there and try to experiment every single time they came out with an album. They were just trying to get somebody to listen to them. So when they broke through with Alive 1, then they go in and say, well, this next album has to be great. So they decided to get a producer, and they did experiment a little bit, but that was just because they like, now we know we can do something.
Yeah.
And then the funny thing is they scrap all that and they go back to their roots on their next 2 albums after that. So in Tool's case, what I'm trying to get at is I like the fact that they have a formula. I like that they have a particular sound because you can identify that. And I think all these albums that we're going to talk about kind of have that vibe to them. So do you have anything else you want to say about Tool?
I mean, I think I pretty much covered everything that I think about them. I mean, those 3 albums are really solid, and mm-hmm. they deserve to be on a list. I don't know if they're the best 10 metal, 3-run albums.
To me, they're like. I mean, a lot of people used to say that Queensryche was a heavy metal version of Pink Floyd. Tool, to me, is a heavy metal version of Pink Floyd. They're very cerebral. They're very talented musicians. They have this thing where they can play heavy, and then they can go into some very atmospheric music. And at the same time, it's Tool. It's still heavy, and they can play just as heavy as the next guy. I mean, Adam Jones can play just as heavy with the rest of them as that's how good he is and how good they are. Danny, their drummer, is amazing. I mean, that dude is one of the best drummers in music, period. I don't think that they should be not included in metal. Like, they're pretty heavy to me, but they're not, like there's other bands that are considered heavy. They're not Testament, they're not that kind of heavy metal, but heavy metal's all over the place. So I don't mind them being on the list.
Well, like I said,
they're definitely not all the way at the top for sure. Okay, so number 9, or the way that this list rolled itself out, number 9 is Slipknot. And the 3 albums that they put down were Slipknot's first, the debut album, Iowa, and then Volume 3. So again, just like Tool, it's the first 3 releases from the band. And just like Tool, they had a previous release that was independent. Tool's was an EP. Slipknot had an independent release that some of the songs were reworked onto the Slipknot album. You're not a big fan of Slipknot, and I know that. These 3 albums, to me, there's really, really, really good songs on each of these 3 albums. And then there's some songs where I just don't get. That's been the relationship that I've had with Slipknot. I really, really like them. My wife really, really likes them, but there are times where I can't listen to this. This is noise, and when I say noise, obviously I listen to metal, so everyone thinks it's noise, but noise in the fact that it's like literally noisy. Did you get a chance to pick out any of these songs on any of these albums that you might think is pretty good?
So, not in particular. I mean, I'm kind of familiar with all like the hits on them because a lot of friends and stuff would listen to them when I was in high school. Mm-hmm. These were the albums right in the pocket for that time period for me. So I'm familiar with like Left Behind. What's the one off of the 3rd album that everybody knows? Was it Duality? Is that
Duality?
That was a big one that was on the radio. Slipknot was a band that just never did it for me. And, like, Corey Taylor, he's interesting. I've seen him on a lot of, like, horror documentaries and that kind of stuff. I don't really have a problem with the guy. I just never liked his vocals. Never really liked their music. So it's hard. I just feel like I don't really have much of a dog in this fight, I get their popularity, and they're freaking huge, but to me, it's just never a band I got anything from.
The funny thing about them is, like I said, when I first got into them, there was that groundswell, very similar to what I was hearing about Pearl Jam back in 1991. It's like there's this band out of Seattle called Pearl Jam. So now I'm hearing there's this band out of Iowa called Slipknot. When you're in the music business, and now in 1999 I wasn't in the music business, but I had connections still. So some people were sending me info, dude, you got to hear this band, you got to hear this band, you got to hear this band. Then you hear other people that you work with. I'm like, man, I heard this band the other day, and it was just like, all right, I need to go see this. So when they came up on Ozfest 1999. I was excited to see them, and they opened up the second stage, 12 o'clock in the afternoon or whatever it was, and it's, middle of summer, it's 100 degrees out, it's probably got to be 105, 110 on that stage, and they're out there with those jumpsuits on and the masks. I mean, I hand it to them. Those guys are athletic in that regards. They have some stamina, but they could play. That's the one thing. They're not just shitty musicians. They're all pretty good, and I got into that first album. There was some really cool songs for me. Wait and Bleed, Eyeless, Sick is a song I really, really enjoy. And so, but there was other songs on there that I just could not get. So I was just like, I'm not into all this extracurricular stuff that goes on in the songs. Give me the song. I mean, yeah, I don't mind hearing stuff go on in the background during a really good song, but when the whole thing is just different sounds that are created by the 9 different people in the band, and it's not necessarily a cohesive song, that's when it kind of turns me off. But then, the next album comes out and it has, a couple of pretty good songs on it. When you're talking about, like you said, Left Behind earlier, the Heretic Anthem is a really cool song in my opinion, and that one probably offends a lot of people because if it says if you're 555, then I'm 666. So there's a lot of people that don't necessarily like that. But
now there's probably more that do like it.
Yeah.
In today's the thing about Slipknot is you said there's 9 members of the band, and I don't know if there's still 9 members or if there was back then.
No, there's still 9 members.
Okay, so that's a lot of instrumentation going on at any given time, and I always felt like, to me, you said noise, and I get that. Like, I get what you mean. There's not a lot of room to breathe. There's always something going on, and it doesn't. To me, it's not appealing because there's not those moments of like ebb and flow that I'm used to, what I enjoy. Like even some of the tech death stuff that I really like has like more of like each instrument has its highlight. Each instrument has a moment to shine. There's moments to breathe. There's musical theory behind it. And I'm not saying Slipknot doesn't have that. It's not what I particularly enjoy. And I think there's a lot of people, obviously, that gravitate towards what they do, and there's a lot of bands that have copied what they do. But it's just, it takes you enjoying that style of music.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, you have to. It's one of those. They're one of these bands that you either like or dislike. It's like a love-hate relationship. You either hate them or you don't. You either love them or you don't. And it's one of those things where I'm more in between than anybody I know in regards to that. And so when you were talking about ebbs and flows, that's what I think about when it comes to Volume 3, that third album in the series. That's the one that has the most ebbs and flows, and that's probably why that album was so huge, because it did have a ballad that was accompanied by a faster version of the same song, or just an alternate kind of, there's a part A and a part B. Part B was the big single. Part A is a little bit more up tempo, but it's the very same melody and stuff like that. And they just kept building on the momentum and Volume 3. So talking about producers before, the first 2 were produced by the band and Ross Robinson. And then they go to Rick Rubin on album number 3. And what's funny about that is Rick Rubin is usually like the Reclamation Project master. But this one, he literally took them and put them over the top. He made them mainstream. And so kudos to Rick Rubin for doing that. And they've now become a super huge band. And you and I have had this discussion before about the who is the next band that's going to be the stadium headliner. Right now, it is Slipknot. How many more years can this band do that? Is another question. But right now, they're the ones that are the next major stadium headliners in metal, at least.
So I feel like they had a thing for alliteration because they went with Ross Robinson. They were on Roadrunner Records. Then they went with Rick Rubin. Then Joey Jordison did the next one. They're basically like Stan Lee at that point.
All right. So now comes number 8, and I know this is a band you're very familiar with. So why don't you go ahead and talk about them?
All right, so their number, I guess, 8, if we're going in reverse, was Slayer. Starting with Rain and Blood, South of Heaven, and Seasons in the Abyss. To me, these are definitely Slayer's best albums. Starting with Rain and Blood, that was just, I think most people would recognize that as a thrash masterpiece. Something about that album, it was short, it was sweet. It was exactly what it needed to be. There's no fluff. There's no extra shit on it. It's just it attacks from beginning to end, and that's all it needed to be. It's 28 minutes.
Yep.
And that's they didn't need any more, and it's perfect for that reason. Then South of Heaven comes out, and they didn't want to do exactly what they did with Rain and Blood. They slowed things down a bit. That was a deliberate style change. But style change is probably a little bit of an overstatement. But South of Heaven is still a really good album. It may not be quite as strong as Rain and Blood, but it's one of my favorite Slayer albums. And then Seasons in the Abyss comes out, and they basically took what they were doing with Rain and Blood and South of Heaven and mixed it in between. And it's one of their strongest albums, and I would say a lot of people would view it as their strongest album. So 3 right back-to-back excellent albums.
It absolutely. And here's the funny thing, and it reflects in terms of record sales. You know, you've got the first 2 albums, which were independent. It puts them on the map, and then they explode with Rain and Blood. South of Heaven, you know, continues to flow, and they literally just flipped the script and said, no, we're going to go slow now. You know, how much faster can we get? You know, but they still were thrashy. You know, and then Season of the Abyss was the perfect, you know, combination of the 2. And it shows because, you know, each album went gold, and, you know, Rain and Blood, you know, says here 766,000 units sold, South of Heaven 500,000, and Seasons in the Abyss 813. So they progressed. You know, they digressed a little bit with South of Heaven, but that could be expected when you have a bunch of fans that were looking for this really fast album, and then all of a sudden South of Heaven comes out. There was a little bit of disappointment at first, but when you really break it down, the songs are very good. They're heavy. They are not necessarily as fast as the stuff on Rain and Blood, but still heavy and still pretty quick. You know, and then Season of the Abyss was just, they had some really good songs in that one.
Yeah, and Slayer has a ceiling on them because maybe not so much nowadays, but part of it was that their music, there's a lot of it that was satanic. It was you know, kind of scary at the time, and it's something that would have held them back, you know, as opposed to their contemporaries like Anthrax, Megadeth, Metallica. They weren't directly satanic. They may have been singing about, you know, some rough content and stuff in some particular songs, but Slayer was the only one that was deliberately trying to sing about evil. And that changed, like with between Rain and Blood, South of Heaven, and even Seasons in the Abyss. They kind of shifted more towards real world horrors, you know, as they went along. But still, they have an image. You know, they have their pentagram on their logo. You know, they have albums that preceded it that have like a goat man. You know, so they, you know, those are things that are always going to hamper them, but that didn't matter. Slayer was Slayer, and they were going to do what they were going to do, and I have all the respect in the world for them for that. But you have to know that you're not going to be the number one band in the world when you're scaring, you know, half the listeners out in the world.
You're absolutely right. But that the funny thing about that is that, you know, they were very evil in Show No Mercy, Hell Awaits, and even a lot of Rain and Blood. But Rain and Blood was exactly that. It was a crossover point where they said, I'm going to talk about real life atrocities and not just about, you know, good versus evil and Satan's going to kill you and stuff like that. And so that Rain and Blood was that crossover.
It was the start of it, but there was still, like, Jesus Saves, still has some, you know, Altar of Sacrifice, you know, stuff like that. But then what was it? Was it on South of Heaven that has, no, it was on Season of the Abyss has, like, Dead Skin Mask, and that's where they're more even further shifting into like real world things, basing it on serial killers and that kind of stuff. And that's still at that point, I mean, now every woman loves to watch stuff about serial killers, you know, but back then Slayer should be like number one for all women, right? They sing about their favorite subject. No, I'm just kidding.
It's just a little harsh. It's a little harsh.
I'm kidding, kind of. Every girl I've ever dated it loves serial killers.
My wife's into it.
My
wife is into it, man. It's just like, what are you watching? Like, I can't even watch that crap. You know, it's like, I don't care about how this guy got, how this person got chopped up into 100 pieces.
I don't want to watch this this documentary about Ed Gein. I'm gonna go listen to Slayer's Dead Skin Mask instead.
Anyway, so and the thing about those three albums, and pretty much most of Slayer's career from that point forward, the albums were all produced by Rick Rubin, so they all had some similarity. There was a tie-in, and they were his first really big band, and yet at the same time, in 1990, I believe it was, the Black Crowes, it was a big band for him as well when they came out with Shake Your Moneymaker. He was the executive producer on that one, so he put him on their label and put the money up for him. So, these three albums were definitively the best of Slayer's career. All right, so number 7, or the way they put it on this list, is Sepultura, Arise, Chaos AD, and Roots. I might not necessarily agree with those three albums, but I can see why, because each one progressively got bigger and bigger for the band.
I mean, Roots was one of their biggest albums to date at that point. I guess even still today, really. But for me, I like Beneath the Remains way more. I think those three, in my mind, are like if somebody was going to say like what three albums define Sepultura, to me, Chaos AD is the pinnacle, and it started with Beneath the Remains.
I see. I see your point there, because Beneath and Arise, very similar albums, and you can see the progression. Mm-hmm. And we talked about them. I believe we did a head-to-head on those, right?
Those two albums. Yeah.
So you could see where the progression was from there, and then it all led up to the signing to Sony Music, and Roadrunner Records had a distribution deal with Sony Music, and so they got a ton of money behind it. It was really well produced for Chaos AD, I'm talking about, and they really, really had the time to put in some good songs. So you could see why Chaos AD was so good. Roots, it was they got to that point now where we're established. Let's go ahead and experiment. Let's get back to our roots. Normally bands who get back to their roots, they go back to the original style that they were playing. They don't really go back to their roots.
Like the roots of their country.
Yeah, exactly. And again, nothing wrong with that. The album was very good. It wasn't for everybody per se. Like, you're not a big fan of it, but I do like some of the songs on it.
I respect it. I think it's a good album, but it's not like when I heard Chaos AD, I thought this is amazing, and then I hear Roots, and I'm like, I respect it, but I don't love it. Right.
I mean, I totally understand that. And, going through the whole thing again, each album has its different sound, and what's amazing about it, what makes that happen, Arise was produced by Sepultura and Scott Burns. That was, Scott Burns was the ultimate Florida death metal producer, and he had Morris Sound in Tampa. That I believe that album was recorded there in Tampa, and that explains why. So that being recorded at Morris Sound, it had that Florida death metal vibe to it, especially with Scott Burns recording. So that was the end of the era for Sepultura in that regards, because then when they got the distribution deal with Sony, they were able to, or not them, but Roadrunner put a ton of money behind the next album from Sepultura because they saw the progression with Arise. I mean, there was a big groundswell, and then they gave them a ton of money. Go ahead and do Chaos AD, but they got producer Andy Wallace to do it. Phenomenal job. We all know that album is great. And then with Roots, they got Ross Robinson, who was this guy who did Slipknot's first album. So they were progressing and trying different things, and each producer gave them a different sound. So you could see how, like, other bands that have the same producer, their sound kind of stays the same. the producers have a big effect on bands that more than people think. So
yeah, and then after that, I guess Sepultura would kind of implode and then change their direction entirely.
Yeah, they completely went in a different direction. I mean, not musically, they still played metal. It's just Max quits, and then they get Derek Green, and they've stabilized, in recent years, but they did have a tough time for a while.
Yeah, what I mean is, so they are still groove metal, and they do still have a lot of new metal, but they've gone kind of back and forth with their sound, with thrash, with kind of introducing different elements into it, and they've never, to me, had like a consistent sound per album since that point. There was like a clear progression, and then they've kind of like bounced a little bit back and forth with everything since then.
Yeah, and that's the sign of the times. They had a rough time there in the late 90s. So,
all right, so we were talking just about groove metal. So that brings us to number 6, which would be Pantera. Pantera, as we know, had 4 albums before they really hit their like breakthrough. But everybody kind of knows Cowboys from Hell is their first album, and that's really how it is. Like, yeah, it's trivia to say there's 4 albums before, but nobody heard those. So
I mean, Dimebag was a teenager and his dad was producing it in the backyard. I personally, yes, their albums, they have been released. I don't personally count that as a Pantera release.
They have their fan base, but yeah, it's just trivia at this point. So starting with Cowboys from Hell, then Vulgar Display of Power and Far Beyond Driven. Those are the albums they selected, and I 100% agree with this one. So they did get heavier with every album. So they have 5 albums, essentially. And from beginning to end, somehow they got heavier and heavier with each album. But that doesn't necessarily equate to the best albums. The best albums to me are, starting with Cowboys from Hell, my favorite is Vulgar Display of Power. And then Far Beyond Driven is almost as good in my opinion. That's debatable. Everybody kind of has either one of these 3 as this album or as their favorite album. To be honest, it's very rare when I've heard anything different. I do know a guy whose favorite is Great Southern Trendkill, which is surprising to me. But but Pantera, they defined what groove metal would be. There's always the debate about what was the band that was kind of doing groove metal before we saw them live. Hoarder. So Hoarder, there's always the debate, like, did they take the style from Phil did fill in some stuff for Hoarder and took some of that and took it back over to Pantera. Who cares? These albums are freaking fantastic. That's all that needs to be said.
Okay, I won't say anything.
All right, let's move on.
No, I mean, Pantera, you said everything there is to really say about it. Those 3 albums are amazing. My favorite album is Far Beyond Driven. You could see the progression with each album. My favorite song from them is Cowboys from Hell, but my next favorite song is I'm Broken. So, which is off of Driven. It's a progression. The band was just tighter and tighter and tighter. And, again, why you got these 3 albums all produced by Terry Date. So there's some consistency there. There's some familiarity there. And each time they get better and better. So it's hard to knock anything that Pantera did. These 3 albums are amazing.
Yeah, the only one they did that wasn't produced by Terry Date was Reinventing the Steel. And Reinventing the Steel has its own set of problems. I mean, the band was collapsing by that point. But he did actually come back and do a new mix, which I think was on the 20th anniversary. I haven't heard it yet, but I've heard that pretty much any of them past the Cowboys from Hell re-release, which was garbage. All of them after that have have been better. So I try to stick to the original releases of all those albums. I think they were pretty much perfect as they were. And Pantera's this bubble that unfortunately it'll never be again. It's just a short period of time, but man, did they they burned out hard. Like they say, like, what is it's better to what's the classic,
it's better to burn out than fade away.
Yeah. And that's kind of what they did. Like they went hard until they didn't, and they were gone. And they're a band that I still revisit all the time. And I don't really like, they talk about reunion shows with other people and stuff like that, and not really being Pantera, but just Phil and Rex playing with other people, and that's cool. I know he does his thing with all the bands that, like, I mean, Phil plays with all the bands that he plays with, and they'll do Pantera songs here and there, and that's fine. But I don't want to see anybody try to be Dimebag and Vinnie Paul. I mean, it just, Pantera was great, and they will be great, and there are a lot of people that still love them, and you still hear them, and that's all that matters. They left their impact.
They did. Dimebag left a long lasting impact,
and so many musicians just love Dimebag, and you can see why, and that they're all influenced by him, and I don't think any guitarist will ever let Dimebag truly die.
No, not at all. The fine thing about Dimebag, I've been listening to a few audiobooks, and these guys all mentioned Dimebag, and apparently Dimebag likes to make people alcoholics. He turns them into drinkers. But that's Dimebag. I mean, if everyone knows Dimebag, Blacktooth Grin. So, cheers to Dime on that one. And to Vinny, because Vinny was the ultimate partier. So, all right. So that brings us to number 5 on our list, which is Motorhead, Overkill, Bomber, and Ace of Spades. That 3-album run was pretty special for Motorhead. At the time that those albums came out, I was not into Motorhead, so I'm going back and understanding of those albums, like way back in terms of, I've really just gotten to Motorhead within the last 10 years.
Okay.
And those albums are way, early 80s. So, actually even 79.
79 and 80. 2 years releasing 3 albums that are phenomenal.
Yeah, it's crazy. Overkill, I mean, these 3 albums are super, super influential when it comes to all the bands that we really like now. And that's amazing in and of itself. I mean, we talk about Pantera, we talk about Sepultura, Slayer, and Slipknot. All these bands love Lemmy and had some sort of, Lemmy has some sort of influence on everybody out there.
I mean, some of my favorite bands even now are still releasing covers of Motorhead songs. Beast in Black did Killed by Death just, a couple years ago. So even genres that you don't even think of are still doing covers of Motorhead. Everyone in the metal community has been impacted by Lemmy and, the various members of Motorhead. Some really great musicians pass through there. I mean, think about Mickey D and who all he's played with.
Oh, Mickey's a phenomenal drummer. He's better than James Kotak or Kotak, whatever his name is. Kotex.
He's dealing with some problems. Let's not be too hard on the guy.
Mickey D's still better than him. There's things about Motorhead, these 3 albums that I really, really, really enjoy. I mean, Overkill is such an influential song for that double bass drumming that is on there. Damage Case, Metallica covered that, Stay Clean. In reality, if you think about it, Overkill itself is probably the weaker of the 3 albums, in my opinion. I
tend to think of as Bomber as the weak one of the 3. It's it's got a few good tracks. Bomber itself,
Dead Men Tell No Tales, Stone Dead Forever. I mean,
yes, it's debatable.
Right, it's debatable. To me, those two are very, very close to each other. Ace of Spades just broke the door down when it came to
that's the hit,
what they were playing. Yeah, I mean, Ace of Spades, Love Me Like a Reptile.
Shoot you in the back.
The Road Crew.
We Are the Road Crew.
Shoot You in the Back.
Jailbait.
The Chase. Yeah, The Chase is Better Than the Catch. I mean, it was just such a good album.
Mm-hmm.
So so you can see that progression. They get kind of. I guess because both Overkill and Bomber came out in '79, you would almost think it was maybe leftover songs from one session, and they were then given an opportunity to put out another album. So they said, okay, well now we can put these songs out. So, and especially because this is technically towards the beginning of their career, although they had been around for a couple of years at this point, but now they were actually what you would call recording artists. And so I think those two albums being in the same year, it was kind of a leftover, at least some of the songs. But then Ace of Spades to me is probably from the ground up a brand new album. And that you could tell the difference.
Yeah, and it's funny because everybody always thinks of that classic lineup of Motorhead with Fast Eddie Clarke and Filthy Animal Taylor. And that was a very brief amount of time. I mean, their last album together was in '82, and that was Iron Fist, which we've talked about Motorhead, and Iron Fist is not a great album. It's a kind of
it's a good song, but it's not a great album.
It's about the only good song on the album, really. It's a bad note to leave out on with that lineup, but again. An album or a set of albums by a group of guys that just shared the same vision, really put out awesome stuff, and unfortunately, that's just a time capsule. It's just sometimes bands don't function well together, and it's best to move on. And we talked about that also, where once Lemmy found his lineup, then there's some really good stuff in their later years that I think a lot of people gloss over, but there's nothing really better than these three albums.
No, these three albums are amazing. All right, so
well, I guess I get to talk about Metallica.
Yes. Yes, you do.
All right, so Metallica, and this one I think is can be taken up for debate because I think there up through the Black Album, every album is really solid. Right? So their list is Kill 'Em All, Ride the Lightning, and Master of Puppets. I think there's an easy way, if you're a fan, you can debate for Ride the Lightning, Master of Puppets, and Justice for All. You could even say Master of Puppets and Justice for All Black Album. But to me, I kind of agree with their list. Kill 'Em All, Ride the Lightning, Master of Puppets. Those are the three. Like when I think of Metallica, for me, at what I enjoy as a band from them, it's these three albums. I love Injustice for All. I think it's one of their best albums, but I almost feel like it sits on an island by itself because it's the post-Cliff album, and then the same thing with Black Album. It's kind of an island unto its own. So these three albums have continuity. You can see there is constant progression, and they have the same lineup. And they're all amazing albums. There's the rawness of Kill 'Em All. Ride the Lightning is really kind of where they started to truly find their more defined sound. And then Master of Puppets is just, it's a masterpiece. Let's be honest.
Yeah, I'm not going to deny that. I agree and disagree with this little list that they have here with these three albums. I may hint talk about it a little bit more later, but
oh, don't tell me you're gonna go with Load, Reload, and what's Saint Anger?
We'll talk about that later. Kill 'Em All. The thing about Kill 'Em All is that they didn't have the control that they desired. Lars Ulrich and James, for the most part, have been in control of their, for lack of a better term, of their existence as Metallica since the beginning. And it's always been, this is what we want. Don't mess with it. And it's hard to break that barrier with them. And they just were not given that control on Kill 'Em All. And even though they had been playing these songs forever, sound-wise, they didn't get exactly what they wanted. But hey, I'm not going to complain. I think the album sounds pretty good, especially for a really, really low-budget debut album. I mean, it's the best sounding of the big four albums to come out.
The debut, yeah.
In my opinion, So yeah, the debut albums, and so I'll leave it at that. Ride the Lightning and Master of Puppets, they found their groove, they found their formula, and they actually, even after Cliff was killed and they had to replace him with Jason, they kept the formula with And Justice for All. And we'll talk about that a little bit more later. But the Ride the Lightning, Master of Puppets, immediately Ride the Lightning, produced by Metallica, assisted by, it was engineered and assisted production by Flemming Rasmussen and Mark Whitaker, who wrote a book about Metallica and was like one of their friends, was also helped them out. Master of Puppets, Metallica and Flemming Rasmussen produced it. You could see that they just found their groove, and they were gonna stick with it at least in those two albums. Not much else to say. I mean, they're my favorite band for a reason, and these three albums have a lot to do with that. So, I agree and disagree to some point with this part of the list.
That's fair enough.
All right, so that means I get to introduce Iron Maiden. Number 3, Number of the Beast, Peace of Mind, Power Slave from Iron Maiden, all produced by Martin Birch. So that tells you something right there. This was for what it is in Iron Maiden's history, this was a historic run by Iron Maiden. 1982, 1983, 1984, 3 albums, 3 years, boom, boom, boom. I mean, in reality, it was 5 albums in 5 years, but these 3 just were absolutely phenomenal.
Oh yeah,
especially Number of the Beast.
So you could easily add, in my opinion, 4 albums to this list. You could go Iron Maiden, Killers, Number of the Beast. You could go Killers, Number of the Beast, Peace of Mind, etc. Even all the way up to Seventh Son of the Seventh Son. I think, to me, those first 7 albums, they're just timeless. They're amazing. I know some people don't like the sound on Somewhere in Time and Seventh Son. I completely disagree. I think everything up to No Prayer for the Dying is pretty much perfect in my opinion. Like I love those albums. So that's a time period that, from the beginning with Paul Di'Anno to the Bruce run from 82 to 88. Everything they put out, I can listen to all those albums from beginning to end and not skip a track. Once you get into No Prayer for the Dying, I think that's where they started to kind of lose some steam. Obviously, it wasn't long before Bruce would leave the band. So if you're going strictly with that first run, yeah, Number of the Beast has to be included in it. Peace of Mind, freaking great album. Power Slave, to me, I like Power Slave more than Peace of Mind. That's, again, it's up to you to decide as a listener, but it's like neck and neck on those albums. So, yeah, I'm gonna say yes on this list because it's hard for me to I could pick any of them and I'd be happy.
If this list was like back to back albums instead of a 3 album run. That's why the list shrinks dramatically. There are so many, after looking at my wall of CDs, there are so many back-to-back album runs from bands that are amazing.
You mean like just 2 albums?
Yeah, just 2 albums.
Oh, yeah. That could be a whole nother episode.
Right. And there's just way too many of them. But when you get to the third album, to get to that third album, the list drops dramatically. And I was looking at some, trying to come up with my big four, and I'm like, okay, so this band's got these two really good albums, and that third one, a little clunker there.
Or like the third one's not great, and then the fourth one is, and you're like, ah.
Yes, yeah, exactly. Like, why is that thing in the middle there? You screwed everything up. So, but Iron Maiden, they just progressed each one. Iron Maiden to Killers, those two albums from Paul Di'Anno, you could see the progression night and day from one album to the next. Plus, you can also see the difference a producer can make for you. Martin Birch produced Killers. And it was a night and day difference in sound,
yep.
From Iron Maiden to Killers. But once they put in Bruce, the songwriting changed completely. And that's why I could never put 1, 2, and 3. I could never put Maiden, Killers, Beast because of Paul and then going to Bruce. To me, this list has to at least start Beast, Peace of Mind, Powerslave. Some people might sit there and say Peace of Mind, Powerslave, and was it Somewhere in Time? But even though you like Somewhere in Time a lot, and I like Seventh Son a lot, there you can tell there's a defining line once the whole touring cycle for Powerslave was over, and they released Live After Death. That was a dividing line in their career, and they made a lot of changes in their sound for Somewhere in Time, and then they kind of made some adjustments to that sound for Seventh Son. And those two albums to me are a back to back that's hard to beat.
Yeah, no, I get where you're coming from, and I think if you're going to pick three, these are the best three that would be like defining.
Right. So I completely agree with this one. You're next.
All right. Well, this one was a pleasant surprise for me because I think people are now really starting to appreciate this band, but it's one I've loved pretty much my whole life, and this is Death with Human, Individual Thought Patterns, and Symbolic. And I completely agree with this list of three. As much as I love all their albums, Human is really where they hit their stride. That's where they gained the most media attention that they would ever get, and that was with some MTV coverage. They appeared on Beavis and Butthead. Chuck's strongest writing started with Human, and it was where he kind of shifted away from like gore and horror into and he had done that more with the previous album, but when Human hit, this is where it really became social topics and things that would affect anyone in their life, and it became more relatable. The growls, they were new at the time, and I think a lot of people didn't really get it. But now, as that's been a more popular style of music over these years, people are really starting to appreciate Death, which is awesome. These three albums, to me, they are the defining albums of that band. As much as I love Sound of Perseverance, which is their final album, it kind of stands on its own because it has different vocal style. I think that the bass has always been a little bit weaker on that album than any other. Scott Clendenin, good musician, but he just didn't have the quality. Like Steve DiGiorgio is just an amazing bassist, and you had some amazing drummers. Human is a little bit different because Individual Thought Patterns and Symbolic, you had Gene Hoglan on, so there was a little bit more continuity there. But from Human to Symbolic all the way through, there's a progression, and they got better and better with each album. And this pocket of music is just the best from that band. I don't have a lot to say because Death was never a band that I got into. Although since you and I have become friends and have done the show, I've listened to a lot more Death in that regards. I still, for whatever reason, there's something to me, there's a disconnect to me with
Chuck's vocals and the music that it's not, to me, in my opinion, it's not as harmonious of a union as I would like it to be. I don't know how to say it. Like it almost seems like it's kind of weird. It almost seems like there's this music and then this guy put his vocals on top of this music. And for some reason they don't, to me, in my opinion, don't sync properly. And I don't know. I mean, maybe it did more so in the latter years. In the beginning, to me, it was kind of like, what is this? You know, and because yes, Chuck was the one that was able to really get the growl and all that stuff going in that kind of death metal style of vocals. But I feel because of the time, I guess it's really weird. It's because of the time period and the way that they recorded back in those days, in the late 80s and early 90s. They don't record the same way nowadays, so it's a completely different thing. And to me, if he wasn't the singer of his own band, I don't think he could be a singer of another band. You know what I'm saying?
Gotcha.
I
think
don't know.
There's certain musicians that are like that. Like, I think Dave Mustaine is maybe a good example of that, where, you know, he has a very unique style, but because he's such a strong-willed musician, he you know, he does what he wants to do. And I think James is kind of the same way, where, you know, yeah, he could probably fit in somewhere else, but like there's something about it, like he has to be in control of it too. And there's certain guys that are just like that. Like maybe singer-songwriters is probably the best way to define it. You know, guys like Bob Dylan, even, you know, outside of the genre we talk about. But like Bob Dylan is not a good singer, but he totally works with what he's doing. And, you know, I think it's those kind of people that they're the primary songwriter, primary lyricist, etc. They're going to be the one that dictates that sound. And I agree. Like Chuck probably wouldn't have worked well in any other kind of format other than it being his band. And because of that, like it's the same kind of like singer-songwriter syndrome where you can have somebody that's not the best vocalist and it works because there's passion behind it. There's emotion that you wouldn't get if you were singing somebody else's lyrics, you know?
No, absolutely, and I agree with that 100%. You know, he is death, and you know you weren't going to change that. But and I think that's for me what was the reason why I couldn't really adapt, because you know I've said it 100 times, 1,000 times. I'm a hook guy. And you know, the first time I heard Death, I was like, "There's not a hook in sight. Good riffs, but not a hook in terms of melody in the vocals that I felt at the time worked for me."
Yeah, and that's something that affects different people differently. Because you know, for the longest time, I didn't realize that people listened to music in a different way than I did. There are people that don't even really hear the music and they just hear the lyrics, and that to me blows my mind. Like how do you not hear the music? But that's something that there's some people that's just the way they are. They hear the lyrics, and the music itself doesn't matter as much to it as long as it has a beat behind it. I'm like, that how?
No, exactly. You're right. I mean, everyone listens to music differently. Like, for the longest time, my wife didn't understand what a bass line was. Right? And I pointed it out to her, and then she was able to realize that is a distinctly separate, not track. She didn't notice the track itself, but she could then understand why that song sounded the way it did.
Yeah.
And so yeah, she's like, I don't know what the bass line is. I said, all right, listen to this, and I would hum it, however you want to go about showing someone that. And when she heard me do that, then she was like, oh.
Yeah.
So she goes, so that's the bass line. I went, yeah. I said, listen to this. Then it mostly came from Rage Against the Machine. I go, listen to his bass line, and you can hear Tom Morello kind of scratching in the background or making a certain noise. And that, since they were so distinctly separate, she was able to understand it a little bit more. So then there's other times where she can catch a rhythm in the background, and she goes, oh, okay, I hear it in this song. I hear it in that song. So that was pretty cool. And people hear things differently. Again, not to beat a dead horse in this particular case, death was different for me. Mm-hmm. And I've begun to appreciate it more because of you and because of the fact that I've been able to expand my horizons in terms of melodic death metal and stuff like that. I still think to me, he's still hard to understand in many cases, or hard to listen to, but other stuff is better for me. So it's just weird, but I don't take anything away from him. Amazing guitar player. I mean, his guitar work is, bar none.
And I mean, realistically, even he drifted away from wanting to do the vocals. That's why he formed Control Denied, and unfortunately, he passed away not long after that and never got to release his second album. So, it's unfortunate, but at least we have that time capsule of a band where, we have these albums that we can go back and listen to, much like we talked about with Pantera.
Absolutely. And same thing with Motorhead now, too.
Wow. Yeah, that's true.
All right.
And half of Slipknot.
Say what now?
And half of Slipknot.
Yeah. Some of the guys in Slipknot, too. Yeah. So, all right, that brings us to number one. And I can understand why Revolver put this as the number one, because this is the band that basically started it all for everybody that we just talked about. We're talking about Black Sabbath, and we're talking about Black Sabbath, Paranoid, and Master Reality. Those their first three records. And if you notice something on this list, you got 1, 2, 3, 4 bands on this list out of the 10. You're talking about the first 3 albums out of the gate, and so. And everybody else is really more. And I don't know, did I include Pantera in this one? Let's see. 1, 2. No, I did not include Pantera. But Pantera I should include that.
5.
So say it's 5.
Half the list is their first 3 albums. I mean, Pantera, that's debatable, right?
Right, exactly.
They have their first 3 albums or 4 albums were under the radar and nobody heard them. And then
they weren't signed to anybody.
I mean, Sepultura is kind of the same way. The first 2 albums, they like a couple of them weren't even released in the U.S., right? So Beneath the Remains.
You're talking about Schizophrenia. Beneath the Remains was a Roadrunner release, so it was
the first
major
one, but that was their third album. So
right,
so
there was
same
Schizophrenia,
thing.
And what was the other one? It was Morbid Visions.
Yeah.
So. Yeah, and that Morbid Visions and Schizophrenia were both released in Brazil only at first, and then they later on got a distribution deal. But yeah, Beneath the Remains was the first one on Roadrunner.
Yeah, you could include them in the same kind of thing as Pantera, really.
Yeah, you could.
Even Motorhead. I mean, Motorhead, that wasn't their first album, but their first 2 albums were kind of different members. It was like Overkill, I think, was the first one that had the classic lineup. Right? Because they had...
I believe so.
Because the first album had different members. And then On Parole is like demos.
Well, actually, no, they had... on the first Motorhead album, it was the original lineup. Filthy Animal, Taylor Fast, Eddie Clark. But the songs were recorded way earlier, and that's when they went to that shit label that screwed him over, Chiswick.
So it was re-recordings of the first stuff. Okay, that's right. Okay, never mind. Anyway, back to Black Sabbath.
Yes, back to Black Sabbath. So number one, Black Sabbath, the first three albums, the band that started it all. Absolutely three phenomenal albums in a row. You cannot take anything away from those three albums. I mean, especially with Black Sabbath being the first album to have that kind of style, that sound, it just kind of threw you for a loop in 1969, 1970. All of a sudden, then they come out. Paranoid was just such a phenomenal album when it came out. I mean, there was so much momentum behind the band, and it was incredible. That, I mean, I think, if I'm not mistaken, I like 7 of the 8 songs that are on there, if it's that much, because they always have like 10 songs or one song that's attached to another song that's attached to another song.
I mean, if you're referring to Rat Salad's an instrumental that leads into Fairies Wear Boots.
Fairies Wear Boots.
Paranoid, I think, is pretty much a perfect album from beginning to end. The first album, I adore it. I mean, there's not much on there that I don't like, and it depends on the version that you have. It even gets better when it has Evil Woman on it.
I don't understand why that just never made it onto the album.
Master of Reality, that's another one. Sweet Leaf, After Forever, Embryo, Children of the Grave is my favorite Black Sabbath album. I mean, not album, song. Orchid, Into the Void. I mean, that's another almost, if not perfect, album. But I could easily make an argument for the next 3 albums too. Volume 4, Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath is one of my favorite Black Sabbath albums from beginning to end. I think it's pretty much perfect from beginning to end. Sabotage, same way. You've got Supernaut, Changes, Tomorrow's Dream, Snowblind. Then on Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath, you got the title track. You've got National Acrobat, Sabracadabra, Spiral Architect,
Killing Yourself to Live.
That's a freaking fantastic song. You got Hole in the Sky on Sabotage, Symptom of the Universe.
I love that song.
I mean, those albums, the first 6 albums are nearly perfect from beginning to end. And I mean, yes, I'm going to say this list is the definitive one, because to me you have to include Black Sabbath, and then from there, because that's the first one, you have to do the next 2, and Paranoid has to be on that list as well. But you could easily make another argument that like Volume 4 of Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath, and Sabotage should be their own list.
And you could do any combination. You go Paranoid, Master of Reality, Volume 4.
Yeah.
Or Master of Reality, Volume 4, Sabbath, Bloody Sabbath. I mean, it's... Put it this way: those first 6 albums were just amazing, and not many people have a run like that either.
No,
Led Zeppelin, had a really killer run. To me, after everything was great up to Physical Graffiti. After Physical, those last 2 albums, they were questionable. They started doing their little Beatles thing, starting freaking smoking shit and experimenting with all sorts of crap.
I mean, but like, if you think about it, who knows? We were talking about back to back, like Heaven and Hell and Mob Rules. Who knows if they had released another album with Ronnie, they could have had another 3 album run. Black Sabbath has had one hell of a history.
Oh yeah, for sure. So for the most part, I like this list that Revolver came up with. I don't have a lot of disagreements in here, but I have a few. Do you have anything else you want to say about this list?
I mean, I'm in the same boat. I don't know Slipknot, so it's hard for me to judge. Like I said, my feelings on Tool, I think those albums are great. I think there's better metal 3 album runs, but I'm kind of going to go over that when we do our big 4. And then there's other like alterations you could do to certain lists, like we said with Metallica or Iron Maiden, or even Sepultura, where you could kind of adjust it a different song or a different album instead. But for the most part, I think they pretty much nailed it.
Okay, I mean, I can see that. Well, that brings us to the big 4, which is now our big 4 on the 3 album runs, the greatest 3 album runs in heavy metal history. And I definitely have a little bit of a different take. So do you want to go first, or do you want me to go first?
I mean, I can start things off. I started off on the main topic, so why not? So my number 4 is a band we didn't talk about, and I debated heavily. One of the ones we did talk about I left off, and it was because it was kind of a toss-up for me, as far as like the concept of a 3-album run working so well, and I kind of wanted to give them a little bit more coverage here. So I picked Obscura with Omnivium, Acroasis, and Diluvium. So if you're not familiar with Obscura, they are a technical death metal band, and one of my favorites. They released a series of 4 albums that were a quadrilogy, I guess is the best way to put it. They're all related, and they all deal with the beginning and the destruction and the rebirth of a universe, which I think is a really cool concept. And so it's not just a concept album, it's a concept quadrilogy. And the only reason I left off the first of that trilogy, the first of that quadrilogy, which was Cosmogenesis, the only reason I left that one off was because I felt like each one got better from the beginning. And Diluvium, I thought they couldn't get better with Acroasis, and then Diluvium hit, and it was just heavier and even more like crazy with an album. And I love their newest album. I think it's one of their best, but as far as a 3-album run, like this to me was the defining aspect of this band. Then my number 3, we've talked about them before, and they're a band that I have kind of fallen out with, but still I go back to these 3 albums all the time, and that's In Flames with Horacle, Colony, and Clayman. I think Clayman is still one of my top 10 favorite albums of all time, but starting with Horacle, I think these albums are pretty much perfect from beginning to end. I don't skip a track. I love them. We talked very, very early on, like one of the first 5 episodes. I think we talked about concept albums, and I listed Horacle on there, I think, because it's not technically a Horacle album. I mean, a Horacle album. It's not technically a concept album, but it does follow a concept all the way through it. So they don't define it as a concept album, but it does kind of follow that all the way through, and that's something that they kind of did with Colony and Clayman. Clayman's a bit more introspective, something about the, where you are at that stage in your life when you're defining yourself and who you are, and these albums were just they hit me and impacted me at the right time in my life, and I could relate to them, and they're always going to have that kind of special place in my heart. My number 2 is Children of Bottom with Something Wild, Hatebreeder, and Follow the Reaper. If you love neoclassical, this is a really good set of albums. Each one develops from the last. You can see a clear progression from Something Wild, which came out in 1997, to Follow the Reaper, which I believe was 2001. So a short period of time. These are the 3 defining albums that I think most people would say that Children of Bottom, like, this is the time period that they're most associated with. They did produce a lot of albums afterwards, and there's some really good stuff, but Follow the Reaper to me is one of the best albums of all time. If you're a metalhead, I definitely suggest listening to it. If you're not into the growls and that kind of stuff, I totally get it, but at least give it a try. It's a neoclassical masterpiece. And my number 1 is Death with Human, Individual Thought Patterns, and Symbolic. We talked about it earlier, and I gave you the reasons why then, but again, these are the 3 albums that truly define this band. If you are struggling again to deal with the growling and that kind of stuff, at least give a couple tracks like Crystal Mountain. I think you really liked that one.
Yeah, that's a cool song.
Symbolic, the track I think is a really cool intro. Let's see, off of Human, there's Lack of Comprehension. That's one that I think most people have probably heard if they were listening to, MTV when it actually played music. I
like that one too.
And then there's Overactive Imagination on Individual Thought Patterns, Trapped in a Corner, The Philosopher. Those are all songs that are specifically about events in the songwriter's life, and I think they're ones that you can relate to. Again, Growling, it's obviously something I really enjoy. I picked 4 bands that do it. Death metal has always been kind of my thing, melodic death metal specifically, but definitely give these a try if you've never heard them, because there's some really amazing musicianship on all these albums.
I agree. I mean, I like, you turned me on to In Flames and Children, and even some of the stuff that you were just mentioning about death. I mean, I like Crystal Mountain's a cool song. I really like that song. But yeah, I mean, some of the stuff in In Flames, we were talking about their new song, how it sounds a lot like the stuff that's on Clayman. So
I was very surprised to hear that.
So I agree. You got to get used to the vocals, and that if you can do that, then you'll really, really enjoy the music, because the music is really outstanding. Okay, my big 4 heavy metal 3-album run series, not as different as yours, because we have 0 crossover.
I figured,
but you picked something off of the list that was there that Revolver put on the list. So, and you pulled it exactly the same way that Revolver had it. I have one on my list is exactly the same way that Revolver had it. But let me go with number 4. I'm going to go with Dokken and Tooth and Nail, Under Lock and Key, and Back for the Attack. A little bit different, it's glam metal. But if you're listening to metal in the 80s and you had any inkling of these LA bands, Dokken was at the top of their game during this period. Tooth and Nail had some great songs. They were, the single, Just Got Lucky, Into the Fire, Alone Again. I mean, that album was great, and they just continued the success with Under Lock and Key with, songs like The Hunter, It's Not Love, and Lightning Strikes. And then they had that big song on Nightmare on Elm Street with Dream Warriors, and that introed into Back for the Attack. And Back for the Attack, to me, is Dokken's best album, but that's my opinion. There was some really good songs on there with Mr. Scary, the solo from George Lynch, Burning Like a Flame. Dream Warriors, Kiss of Death is an amazing song. Probably Dokken's, heaviest and best song. So that 3-album group, that 3-album run from them was pretty phenomenal in that regards. Number 3, Def Leppard with High and Dry, Pyromania, and Hysteria. Now, I don't think there's a bigger 3-album run and a more progressive 3-album run from a band than those 3. I mean, High and Dry pretty much put Def Leppard on the map with their single Bringing on the Heartbreak. So people kind of got to know them. And then Pyromania, they exploded all over the United States. Mind you, they still were not big in their own UK, but they were huge in America. I mean, how many songs that Foolin', Rock of Ages, Photograph, Too Late. I mean, that album was amazing. Coming Under Fire, I believe, is on that album. So it was absolutely phenomenal. And then they have all sorts of drama in their lives and their careers. And, Rick Allen loses his arm, so they got to now create a way for him to play drums. They overcome all this and release Hysteria. And that just was a monster. of an album, and there's no denying, and you can't take anything away from them. They basically pulled a Michael Jackson with in the heavy metal industry with Hysteria. That's like the heavy metal version or glam version of Thriller. Every song in that album was just great. So that's my number 3. Number 2 is the set that is the same on Revolver's list, and that's Iron Maiden's Number of the Beast, Peace of Mind, and Power Slave. We already talked about how great of run those 3 albums were, and basically how great a run from the point at which they got signed all the way through Bruce leaving the band in 1992. So, or actually he left in 93. So it's that was an incredible run, basically a 13-year run that, you know, they obviously continue to this day. But those 3 albums, Beast, Peace of Mind, and Power Slave, were just phenomenal 3 years in a row. For me, my number 1 is a slightly different version than what Revolver put down. Metallica, Ride the Lightning, Master of Puppets, and Justice for All. Now, I picked that 3-album run over the Kill 'Em All one because of the formula. They created this formula with Ride the Lightning. They kept it with Master of Puppets, and for what it's worth, even with the fact that they have a new bass player, Jason, they kept the same formula. You know, it's a fast song at the beginning, title track second, really super fast song at the end, instrumental somewhere in the, you know, towards the end of the second side. That formula worked for them, and that formula held up on all 3 albums. That's why those 3 albums, to me, are the greatest 3-album run in heavy metal history. So there's my list.
Well, good deal. I mean, like we said, I said there was a case for any of those variations of Metallica for their first 5 albums.
You know, I don't even put the Black Album in that, only because it's such a distinctly different album. But again, you could sit there and say Master of Puppets and Justice for All in the Black Album, and you're talking about 3 masterpieces in 2 different ways. Because you could keep Master and Justice very similar, but definitely the Black Album was a different,
very different
direction altogether.
But again, they're still all good albums that followed each other, and I think that's technically the criteria. But I think we're always going to lean more towards which albums fit together the best, right? So
absolutely. All right, well, that's our big 4 greatest 3-album run in heavy metal history, and that's our show for tonight. So as always, don't forget to tell your friends about us and subscribe to us on your favorite podcast platform.
And don't forget you can interact with us by commenting on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, or you can send us a DM as well. If you listen to us on YouTube, be sure to leave us a comment, or you can just send us an email to debatingmetal@gmail.com. So remember to tune in to the next episode where we spark up another exciting metal debate. On behalf of Kenneth and myself, stay safe, and always turn it up to 11.
See ya.